Welcome to part 1 of a 6-part video, Credit as a Public Utility, the Solution to the Economic Crisis. The purpose of this video is to provide you with the outline for a new monetary and credit system for the United States. This would replace the one run by the banks that has so disastrously failed and is ruining our nation's livelihood and freedoms. My name is Richard C. Cook. I am a former federal government analyst who retired in 2007 after 32 years of public service, 21 of which were with the U.S. Treasury Department in Washington, D.C. I have also taught history, been a farmer and businessman, and today am a writer. One of my books, Challenger Revealed, the insider story about the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster from the time I worked at NASA, has been called the most important spaceflight book in 20 years. My specialty today is public finance. I am a graduate of the College of William & Mary, the alma mater of Thomas Jefferson. Like Jefferson, I believe that the only legitimate government is one that reflects the principle that all men are created equal, and that strives to ensure the values of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Today, we are losing touch with these ideals during this great economic crisis, when the hopes and aspirations of so many are threatened. During the course of this 6-part video, I will be proposing solutions to the huge economic problems facing our country that you may not have heard before. This is because almost everyone in an established position, including economists, media commentators, and government officials, is only trying to put patches on a failed system. Very few are advocating fundamental change, but I am, and so are many reformers around the world. I spent a career in government finance, not working for the big financial interests who lobby and influence most of our politicians, Republicans and Democrats alike. I am going to tell it like it is and think outside the box. So I hope you join me and listen with an open mind. I will be referring to concepts contained in my new book, We Hold These Truths, The Hope of Monetary Reform. I urge you to read this book and think about what I am saying, because if we want ourselves, our families, our communities, our nation, and the world to survive this crisis, we must become informed and active, not tomorrow, but right now, before it is too late. I now want to talk to you about the U.S. economic and monetary system, about what has happened to cause the problems we are facing, and about what can and should be done to change the system, because it's the system that's at fault, and the system that must be changed. As you watch, I would ask you to bear in mind one key fact. This is that virtually all the money that exists today originates with a loan made by a bank, a loan that must be repaid with interest. This includes the loans made by and through the banking system and the banks of foreign nations that allow our government to operate. It means the financial system is really a giant pyramid of debt. Now, why is money created like this? Because the system was set up this way by financial interests who have constantly tried to influence our government ever since the country was founded. But the economy doesn't have to work this way. There are other ways to create money that are more conducive to our common welfare and control of the money supply by the banks. In fact, as a former U.S. Treasury analyst, I can tell you that if Congress approved, the government could create all the money our nation needed without borrowing and with much less taxation. Such change is critical because the debt-based monetary system run by the banks is the underlying cause of today's crisis. But it's also a political, social, and moral crisis. It's a matter of who controls our country and who benefits from that control. Does our country exist for a small number of the financial elite? Or is it a place where we, the people, should be able to live and prosper? The key is what kind of monetary system we have. Even today, with a Democrat as president and Democrats in the majority in both houses of Congress, we still have a system that benefits the financiers above everyone else. They have paid billions of dollars in campaign contributions to make sure of it. There is one other point I want to make before we get started. The afflictions from the debt-based monetary system are compounded when we send that money overseas to foreign nations through our trade and fiscal deficits. The night of Tuesday, February 24, 2009, President Barack Obama made an inspiring speech as he resolved that America would get back on its feet economically. The government finances our national debt by selling treasury bonds, promising to the buyer to repay the principal plus interest. It's too bad the success of the president's plan depends on whether the Bank of China will continue to buy treasury bonds, because we in the U.S. no longer have enough money to pay for our own government. In fact, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had just returned from China the week before President Obama spoke, where she traveled to assure that the government of China would still finance our national debt. This is not as it should be. One debt leads to another under this deeply corrupt system. And that is a reason President Obama's recovery program will fail to ensure long-term prosperity with security for our nation. This means that our quality of life and that of our children and grandchildren will continue to decline. This is why the stakes of what we are talking about in this video couldn't be higher. Let's now move ahead with part 1, entitled Our Early Political Leaders Warned Us Against the Banking Interests. It is obvious by now that central to the disaster our nation is facing is the failed banking system. It is not our producing economy that has failed. The economy of our nation and the world has the capacity to produce the goods and services everyone needs to live. Our nation was created through a monetary revolt against the bankers of Great Britain. Around 1750, Benjamin Franklin wrote that it was impossible to find a happier and more prosperous population on all the surface of the globe. Traveling to England to represent Pennsylvania, Franklin was asked why the colonies were so prosperous when there was so much poverty in England. Franklin replied, "That is simple. In the colonies, we issue our own money. It is called colonial scrip. We issue it in proper proportion to make the products pass easily from the producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating ourselves our own paper money, we control its purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay to anyone." In 1764, the British bankers had Parliament pass the Currency Act. This law prohibited the colonies from issuing their own money. The money supply was reduced by half. Franklin wrote, "In 1 year, the conditions were so reversed that the era of prosperity ended and a depression set in. To such an extent, the streets of the colonies were filled with unemployed." After a decade of economic decline, the Revolutionary War began, not because of the Stamp Act or the tax on tea, which the history books teach, but because of monetary tyranny. Franklin stated, "The colonies would gladly have borne the little tax on tea and other matters had it not been the poverty caused by the bad influence of the English bankers on the Parliament, which has caused in the colonies hatred of England and a Revolutionary War." Now, I want to read a quotation from Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence and was President of the United States from 1801 to 1809. Jefferson wrote in a letter to his Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people, to whom it properly belongs. Jefferson put a great deal of meaning into these few words. He spoke of the issuing power. This refers to the power to issue money. By the time Jefferson was elected president, that power had already been given away by Congress to the private banking system, even though, under Article 1 of the Constitution, authority over the monetary system belongs to Congress. And he spoke of cycles of inflation and deflation. Remember that, please, because this is a concept I will mention many times in this video. Jefferson's successor and personal friend, President James Madison, said in a similar fashion, "History records that the money changers have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible to maintain their control over governments by issuing money and its issuance." Jefferson and Madison made these judgments at a time in American history when the question was being asked whether it should be the bankers or the elected representatives of the people who should control our monetary system. In fact, it was the leading political issue of the day. It should be the leading political issue now, because who controls the money supply and profits from it is the determining factor in our national and economic security. Back in 1791, Alexander Hamilton, President Washington's first Secretary of the Treasury, had persuaded Congress to enact legislation setting up the first Bank of the United States. This bank was modeled on the Bank of England. Both of these institutions gave the power to issue currency to a central bank owned by private interests, a power Jefferson and his followers steadfastly opposed. When the charter of the First Bank of the United States lapsed in 1811, Congress did not renew it, because by then Jefferson, Madison, and their party were running the government, and they understood that a privately owned central bank was the best device ever invented to destroy self-government. But in 1817, with the nation short of funds due to the War of 1812, Congress set up another central bank, the Second Bank of the United States. Again, the private monetary power began to exert so much control over the nation that Andrew Jackson, when he was elected president in 1828, resolved to eliminate it. He said, "The bank wants to kill me, but I will kill it." Jackson said, "If the American people only understood the rank injustice of our money and banking system, there would be a revolution before morning." In 1834, Jackson withdrew the money belonging to the federal government that was on deposit with the Second Bank, and that bank also faded into history. The problem Jefferson and Jackson had with the First and Second Banks of the United States had to do with the way a privately owned central bank works. This was to loan money to the government, which the people of the nation were then responsible to repay with interest from government revenues, including money they paid in taxes. Fractional reserve banking is the method that banks use to keep less cash on hand than they have actually lent. National banks do this by purchasing a certain amount of government debt, treasury bonds, to serve as a reserve base. Once the bank establishes its reserve base, it then creates more money out of thin air. And what do they do with the extra cash? They loan it out to the public to get more money into circulation and to collect interest on it. Always going hand in hand with the central banking system is a large national debt, because when the bank purchases treasury bonds, it is actually lending money to the government and charging interest. Of course, the debt grows the fastest when a nation is at war or has a large and expensive military establishment. But by refusing to go along with a central banking system, Jefferson was able to balance the federal budget for 8 consecutive years, a feat never again accomplished. And President Andrew Jackson was even able to pay off the national debt. Owing nothing to the banks, the government under these early leaders of our country was largely free of the bankers' influence. Now, let me read you another quote, this time by a man named Meyer Amschel Rothschild, founder of the famous Rothschild banking family of Europe. In 1790, Rothschild is reported as having said, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws." During the 19th century, the Rothschilds and their banking allies virtually controlled the monarchies of Western Europe. It was because Jefferson and Jackson understood what Rothschild was talking about that they so strongly opposed the central banking system and kept our republic free. It was the main difference between the royalist and republican systems. But this was to change because the bankers were figuring out how to take over republics as well. Let us move ahead now a few decades to the Civil War, fought between the North and South from 1861 to 1865. When President Abraham Lincoln entered office in March of 1861, the federal government had no money available to fight the war. But President Lincoln needed a lot of money, and he needed it fast. He went to the New York bankers, and remember, there had been no central bank in the U.S. for a quarter century. The bankers, who were closely allied with their British and European counterparts, said they would lend the government money, but at 25 to 35% interest. This was outrageous. So Congress took a radical but entirely logical step. They printed money and authorized the Lincoln administration to spend it into circulation. The result was the greenbacks, a paper currency not immediately redeemable in gold, authorized by Congress in the amount of $450 million. This raw purchasing power was used to acquire the goods and services that would be produced by the economy to fight the Civil War. The greenbacks proved that government did not always need to borrow from the banks to have money to spend. During the war, in addition to the greenbacks, the government raised taxes and sold war bonds directly to the people, in both cases bypassing the banking system altogether. President Lincoln's monetary policy was cited in Senate document number 23 from 1865 in the following words: "The government should create, issue, and circulate all the currency and credit needed to satisfy the spending power of the government and the buying power of consumers." This was exactly what Jefferson had said half a century previously. The citation continued, "The privilege of creating and issuing money is not only the supreme prerogative of government, but it is the government's greatest creative opportunity. By the adoption of these principles, the long-felt want for a uniform medium will be satisfied. The taxpayers will be saved immense sums of interest, discounts, and exchanges. The financing of all public enterprises, the maintenance of stable government and ordered progress, and the conduct of the Treasury will become matters of practical administration. The people can and will be furnished with a currency as safe as their own government. Money will cease to be the master and become the servant of humanity. Democracy will rise superior to the money power." Lincoln's policy pointed out that the issuance of money by representative government is the key to economic democracy. This statement was the most advanced summary of the principles of a democratic monetary system ever made. It was the perfect expression of the principles of a greenback system. Had this system been fully implemented as the basis for public finance in this country, American history would have been far different. But it was not. Next, in part 2 of this video, we will see how Lincoln's intentions were thwarted. We will see how the United States became, in the words of President Martin Van Buren, a bank-ridden society, one that has been run for much of its history by the financial establishment. Again, it is this system that is the cause of today's disaster. Thank you for watching.